weeks. I know there's lots of sessions, and I do appreciate the time that you all dedicate to this meeting and dedicate to the EPSCoR program. And so I appreciate that. I'm excited to talk with everyone this afternoon about the visioning activity that we're conducting over the next year or so, called the Future of NSF EPSCoR. I think you heard Susie refer to it earlier this week. I think you heard some about it in the presentation earlier today. In fact, and you also heard Loretta talk about it extensively if you happened to catch her presentation at the National Science Board meeting yesterday afternoon, which was a great presentation and honestly a great interaction with the National Science Board for the EPSCoR program. So if you haven't had a chance to see that, I do encourage you to check it out when it's available later on. There's definitely a lot of interest in the program and interest in this visioning activity, I think, as part of that. And so we're excited about what we're going to be able to do over the next year. So the short version of what I'm going to be talking about is just that we're conducting a major external visioning activity throughout 2021. This is going to be guided by an external committee of experts. And so the first thing that I want you to take away from this is if you're interested in being deeply part of this effort, we are definitely seeking nominations, and there'll be details on how to do that throughout the presentation here. And then we'll make sure that that's all available to you if you need to find it later as well. There's going to be, beyond the committee itself, there's going to be several pathways for really broad stakeholder input. And so we want to make sure that there's ways for you to contribute your ideas and your thoughts to this process in a way that's really convenient to you wherever you may be and whatever your timeline might look like over the coming months. And so those are all out there. There's a dear colleague letter coming. I was so hopeful that I would be able to plug a number in there. I even checked like half an hour ago. It is going to be published imminently, but it is not up yet. And so I will make sure that that goes out to the community as soon as we have it. Be on the lookout for it. It really honestly should be within a day or two that this is available to you. The information in there will be a lot of the same information that you see in the slides here today. So it won't have any surprises, but it's definitely an easy way to kind of get the information out to you at all. And then there's a website there, an nsf.gov website on this process, so you can see it there. Hopefully somebody will be able to drop it in the chat too. I see that we just did, and so you can check that out as we go. I'll say it's pretty skeletal at this point. That's by design. It's really meant to be a website that's updated as we go, and so I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. So before we wade too far into this, I think there's definitely some value at looking at how EPSCoR has benefited from external advice in the past. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes here just talking about that before we go into what we're looking for in this process. And just a note of appreciation. I know that there are folks who are here in this meeting who have been associated with EPSCoR for a really long time and have been part of these past activities. And really, just a note of appreciation for the advice and the great recommendations that have come out of those and the work that went into those prior efforts. Thank you for that. It really, they continue to influence how the program works. So there's been a few different flavors of these. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. There were other similar activities going back even further in time. But given how much evolution there's been in EPSCoR over the last 15 years, we felt like that was a pretty good window to consider. So one of the flavors of external advisory types of activities that we've had were funded community-run workshops. And so these are EPSCoR 2020, EPSCoR 2030. You can see the timelines for those. These are both PI-led community visioning workshops that resulted in reports that had recommendations that NSF NSF and EPSCoR then acted on and used to guide our future efforts. Then there have been kind of formal external program evaluation. There was one from the National Academies in 2013 that was required by the American Competes Reauthorization. There was a similar one in the following year by the Science and Technology Policy Institute. This is a nonprofit think tank that's kind of affiliated with OSTP. These were both oversight activities and evaluations that were mandated by an external body, by Congress or someone else. And then we've also had, commission studies, and this was something that we talked about earlier today that you've seen a reference to. The 2M study. The 2M is just the company that helped us, the lead company that helped us work on that. This was a study of academic research excellence and competitiveness. I won't talk about the findings of this activity so much, but like Loretta referred to earlier, I will talk a little bit about the framework that came out of this that's really influenced what we're doing. And so these next few slides have a lot of text. The intent is not necessarily for you to read every word of these, although you're welcome to. You can also find all of these studies both on the web now, but we will also make them available on our Future of NSF EPSCoR website here in the next several days. The point that I want you to take from these next couple of slides is that there have been lots of areas of advice that came out of these activities. There have been lots of commonalities across the activities in terms of what the advice here. And I think you can also, if you kind of look at it closely, you can see a pretty obvious trajectory from the recommendations that grew out of these activities to the EPSCoR that you see today. And so that's just an indication of how important these external activities are for driving the direction of the program. So back in 2006, there was an EPSCoR 2020 activity. The recommendations that came out of here did things like helped establish the need for science and technology plans for each of our jurisdictions, and you see those in all of our jurisdictions today. There was a need to create a shared understanding of what success was in terms of our capacity building mission. There was a lot of emphasis on flexibility and innovation, both within the program itself in terms of how we kind of came up with new activities, but also in making sure that our competitions and what we were asking in our solicitations provided opportunities and space for there to be flexibility and innovation within our projects as well. And then there was a recommendation that we really do what we can to give a broader footprint to EPSCoR across NSF and in what types of activities are offered by EPSCoR. So that was EPSCoR 2020. A half dozen years later, there was the EPSCoR 2030 activity. This one, instead of emphasizing defining what success was, this one talked about, we needed to get better at communicating success as a community. There was an emphasis on cyber infrastructure and the need for that. Definitely points about increasing funding for the program that we were chomping at the bit as a community to do more if the resources were there available to us. And then additional kind of comments about needing EPSCoR to be a test bed for innovation and grounding our activities in research capacity. Just as a side note, so I really appreciated and love the kind of recommendations that came out of these committees. The names of these two activities set us on a really challenging trajectory where we had EPSCoR 2020 in 2006. 6 years later, we jumped forward a decade. There were lots of recommendations that we named this activity EPSCoR 2050, which would put the next one at EPSCoR 2100, and then we would be like in the Star Trek age before I retired, and that didn't really seem like the way to go. And so we shifted directions and called it something different this time. Now we're switching over to kind of these more formal external evaluations. And so the one from the National Academies in 2013, the National Academies, the committee there was formally charged with assessing all EPSCoR programs. But I think it's fair to say that most of its focus was specific to NSF and the NSF program. I would say this was more process oriented, more about how the program was run and how that affected its impacts. And so the recommendations that you see here, there was still a focus on research excellence. There were recommendations about restructuring, redesigning the program. There was an emphasis on project evaluation. And so this was something that you definitely saw influence kind of the directions of our activities since then. There was a lot of discussion within this report about our methodology for eligibility. There were some points made about merit review for EPSCoR proposals and how we might look at that differently. This was also one of the places where you saw the idea that the experimental part of EPSCoR that was there in the name initially was maybe dated and it needed to be updated to better reflect our mission. The SIPI evaluation that came out of this, a similar, again, you're hearing themes, I hope. There was, again, a focus on innovation in our activities and in the strategies that we use in our jurisdictions. There was an emphasis on evidence, both in what the activities made sense and what were good metrics for success. And you're hearing that as a theme, I think, throughout the day and throughout the week. And again, some discussion on eligibility and emphasis on building research competitiveness. So these activities have led to many improvements in response to the recommendations. Many changes in the programs, many improvements. You've heard about this through the week. You've heard about, you see this in our RII Track 2, the RII Track 4 activity, which is new and came out of these recommendations. There's been a lot that we have done over the years. There's a couple other examples here. That there's the new RII tracks. We had a very extensive and thorough effort a couple of years ago to take a close look at how we did eligibility. And I think we had a very strong positive outcome out of that to make it a more transparent process, more fair, more stable for the jurisdictions who are involved. We have had substantial expansions of program funding, substantial expansions of staffing to keep up with that funding. Clearly, I think room for growth in both of those areas still, but there's been a lot of improvement. There's been changes in how we focus on evaluation, how we collect program data. You're hearing about that as a theme today, and including specific things like changing our name and having specific targeted workshops on communication to better tell the EPSCoR story. We've heard references to that through the week too. So again, the takeaway here is, these are not reports that just get put on the shelf, ignored, right? Like when we get external advice, we act on that external advice, and we really have seen a lot of positive impacts on the program over the years from that external advice. And then just to kind of wrap up this section, there's another type of assessment or oversight activity that we go through regularly called a committee of visitors. This is a formal process within NSF. It's not unique to EPSCoR at all. It's required every 4 years for programs or offices within NSF that recommend and award grants, cooperative agreements, or contracts, and whose main focus is the conduct or support of NSF research in education and science and engineering. So clearly EPSCoR falls within this category, and so we have our own dedicated committee of visitors every few years. But the focus of these activities is not strategic per se. It's not a visioning kind of activity. What it is the main purpose of these is to assess the quality and the integrity of program operations, and to kind of look at the program level technical and managerial matters pertaining to proposal decisions. So more than anything, it's focused on, are we doing merit review well? Are we running our competitions well? Are our solicitations clear? Those types of things. Very, very kind of operations oriented. On the other hand, these committees are usually committees of experts who are well-versed in science and well-versed on kind of the science ecosystem. And it's quite common for COVs to also provide broader input on program strategies. And so you see that in some of the past ones. In 2015, there was a recommendation that we should have a standing advisory committee. There's a lot of complications in that I don't really have time to go into today, but that's a tricky thing. But in our most recent COV, there was a specific recommendation about encouraging and hosting a future of EPSCoR meeting, so something like this. And aligned with that was an encouragement to continue to identify opportunities to design, shape, implement innovative programs that serve our community, right? And so this is really kind of a prime motivation to do exactly the types of things that we're talking about doing. So moving on, so we've talked about how we have a strong history of benefiting from external advice, and we have a big recent push to continue to seek this kind of advice. I don't think there's any disagreement about either of those points, that these things are important and they have real strong positive impacts on how the program runs. So if we're looking at a new future of EPSCoR activity, what do we want to learn? What kind of focus will yield the information that we can build on going forward? So we know we're not starting from scratch. Many of you have seen versions of these particular graphs before. These are the charts that we use most commonly, I think, to demonstrate the positive trajectory of our jurisdictions collectively. The one on the left groups jurisdictions by cohort based on when they first became eligible for EPSCoR support. Across all the cohorts, you see that there have been really substantial improvements in how well the jurisdictions are competing for NSF resources. This compares the most recent 5 years to the initial 5 years that they were affiliated with EPSCoR. And so you're all collectively competing for a bigger piece of the pie. And that's exactly what we want to see, because again, it's a signal that the research ecosystems in the jurisdictions are becoming more healthy, more vibrant, more robust. And that's really the point of the program. That's our mission. The right side of the figure, the right side figure shows that the number of proposal submissions and awards cumulatively from EPSCoR jurisdictions going over the last decade. Success rates are trending up. So in that sense, that there's better competing for NSF resources. On the other hand, I think the figure on the right is not kind of all unambiguously good news. Success rates are up, but the award numbers look pretty steady to my eye. And in fact, it looks like most of the increased rate of success is not due to more proposals getting funded as much as it's due to kind of larger submission numbers. And so some of that can be good strategic, right? Like that means that the proposals that are coming in are on average more better and are more likely to get funded, and people are kind of getting rewarded at higher rates for the efforts that they're putting into it. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that there's more resources going to the jurisdictions. And so that's something that maybe we need to understand better. And I think there's other questions that come up fairly regularly about the robustness of the long-term trajectory for research competitiveness. There's questions on the right here. These are definitely not my questions, right? These are questions that are kind of the flavors of questions that we get fairly often from NSF leadership, from the public, from our stakeholders, sometimes from Congress and from the Office of Management and Budget. Some of the questions reflect misperceptions that we can and do correct, that graduation is kind of the main target outcome, for example. But there's also, there's some that are grounded in trends that people see in the data that are worrying, metrics that have plateaued, or sometimes metrics that have maybe started moving in the wrong direction. And so you can see some of what I mean in the table here. This is pulled from a report to Congress in 2019 that Liz put together. There's downward trends in several key metrics, in publications, in students supported, and faculty hired, things like that. We think some of this is connected to how data are reported, which in some ways maybe emphasizes some tracks more than others, some activities that we do more than others. So there's some questions I think maybe there, but I don't think we have a full explanation. And for sure, we'd like to understand the issues here so that we know how to adapt and progress. And so that kind of brings me to the academic research excellence and competitiveness, the AREC framework that Loretta talked about today. This is another recent effort that's helped frame our thinking going forward. And it came, so in response to some earlier recommendations and along with other factors, we commissioned this study a couple years back to help us have a framework to understand how to think about academic research competitiveness. You saw some of the results from this at last year's meeting. You're starting to see the influence in our thinking, I think, right? So Dr. Iacono in her presentation earlier this week referred to this. Loretta pulled it out during the questions part of the session earlier today. It's something that we think about and that influences how we look at our program, how we look at our activities. So there's a lot going on with the framework. I don't want to dwell on it too much here because it's come up a couple times already, but I think it's helpful to illustrate how it's guiding our thinking. So a key concept here is that there's really 4 levels of analysis, that we do things and we can look at impacts at the individual level, at the team level, at the institution level, and at the jurisdiction level. These are nested in terms of size, obviously, like the number of people involved in each one, but they're also nested in terms of the time scale that we see, and maybe in the scope and the stability of the impacts that we see. I'll make one note that I'm trying to, where we see university in it, I've been trying to change it to the institution, because I think university is a little bit too narrow relative to our scope. And so I talk about things in terms of institutions. I think one takeaway that we need to have from this is that our activities and the things that we're doing in our competitions are a lot focused at the individual, the project team, the institution scales. But the questions that we get and the kind of top level assessment of our impacts and the description of our mission are all kind of at this jurisdictional level. And so we need to, when we're thinking about the future of the program and when we're thinking about how these things interact, we need to reconcile some of those distinctions between how we're looked at in terms of program success and in terms of jurisdictional success relative to the timescales and the scopes of the projects that we fund. And I think this came up in some of the questions earlier today. I think it's been captured in some of the points that we're making. How do we show these connections better? And so to dive into this a little bit more, the nesting of these levels is really key. The theory of change that we operate under is that things that we're doing at the kind of smaller individual team institution levels, that these effects propagate outward over time. And similarly, like changes that happen, whether they're from EPSCoR or not, changes that happen at the jurisdiction and the institution scale also propagate inward and influence how individuals and how teams are able to adapt. That these nested levels implies that there's ripple effects moving outward and ripple effects moving inward. And so even though we're mostly funding things at the individual level, at the team level, and kind of at the institution kind of jurisdiction boundary for track one, that's not really the only place that we can see some of the effects. And there's a little bit of a snag here too, is we won't necessarily always see an immediate move in the needle when some of these investments that we make at the individual level and at the team level, the scope of our funding, the scope of our projects, as we kind of saw in the slide, in the figure from this morning's presentation, all the things that we're doing, all the money that we're investing is really relatively small compared to what's going on at the jurisdiction at the whole. And so there's going to be some, maybe dilution isn't the perfect word, right? But we can't put all the shoulders on a track 4 project or on a track 2 project or even a track 1 project to really show immediate moving of the needle of what's going on at the jurisdiction. Our whole theory of change is about cumulative effects over time from repeated engagements, repeated interventions to kind of help move institutions and individuals on a trajectory so that we see these positive impacts on the jurisdictions over time. And so that I think works, and I think it's the right approach, but it does leave us with an assessment challenge, right? So one is the in fact, maybe a twofold assessment challenge. One factor here is how do we understand whether there are tangible positive impacts that are missed when we talk about our projects and program? Are we losing sight of some of the impacts by having so much of the conversation focus at the jurisdiction level? And I think conversely, are we missing opportunities for greater impacts? Are there things that we could be doing that would advance our long-term mission? And we're missing these things because of the challenge of working across these nested levels. Maybe to kind of continue the ripple analogy, are there things that we could be doing that would create bigger and faster propagating waves that really aren't part of our portfolio or aren't a big enough part of our portfolio right now? And so all of these things together, we've tried to kind of take all of these concepts and frame them into a couple motivating questions for our activities for this visioning activity that we're having. And so the first of these, and I'll go ahead and read them. what does the available evidence tell us about the effectiveness of NSF EPSCoR's current investment strategies, both individually and collectively, in advancing scalable jurisdiction-wide solutions and best practices to achieve the program's goals? And then secondly, based on the answers to the above, are there novel strategies or changes to the current strategies that will enable NSF EPSCoR and its partners, just jurisdictional partners, to achieve its mission more effectively? And so if you read these, I think there's a couple things that maybe jump out of you. So one is that the focus on evidence is really key. You heard Clemencia and Cynthia talk about this today. We see it as critical that this effort gets past kind of assumed connections and across levels towards things that we can really know and build upon. And I think the second is that the attachment to the jurisdictional mission is also foundational. We really still ultimately, our mission really is still ultimately tied to jurisdiction level capacity gains and jurisdictional level success. And so we're emphasizing our partnership with the jurisdictions, that the NSF program can't solve all of these problems alone, and that we see shared commitments is really vital to the success. Beyond that, some of the broadness is intentional. We want there to be space to explore these issues in an open way. And so we don't want to put our finger too much on the scale in terms of what we want, the direction that we want this process to go. We want to have questions that are pushing the discussion in a direction, but not kind of presupposing any types of solutions or anything like that. And I think you can see in all of this implicitly and explicitly now that this is really aligned with NSF's evaluation strategy that Clemencia and Cynthia were talking about before. Here's the question that was there before that came from the annual evaluation plan. This was talked about in the previous presentation. You can see the link there for this plan if you want to grab the PDF for yourself. But you can see when you read about this evaluation plan, it really lines up closely with the framework that we've been talking about, with the kind of guiding questions for this process. So moving away from kind of the conceptual part, what are we actually going to do? What is this process actually going to look like? So when we were going into the design of this process, there were some parameters, some things that we said, okay, this is what we want this process to achieve. Well, this is not in terms of what the advice that we get is, but in terms of what we want it to look like. And so these are some of the design parameters that kind of went into how we put all of these pieces together. One is that we wanted the NSF role to be guiding. We want to kind of put a framework around how the process would look, but we don't want to be a dominant voice as this process is ongoing. We have our opinions. We kind of know what we think about certain things, but we really want to understand what the community thinks, and we want to understand where the evidence takes this process and have an open mind about what it's going to reveal. So we don't want to have our thumb on the scale throughout the whole thing. We think it's really crucial to reach broadly into the EPSCoR jurisdictions. We definitely want to hear the voices of those who are currently engaged with the program, all the folks who are here today, but we don't want to just hear from voices of people who are currently engaged with the program. We think that there's a lot of untapped potential for engagement in different ways, and we want to make sure that there's space for those voices to be part of this process as well. So we want to build in multiple pathways for input. We don't want to just have it be kind of a one-shot deal where if you miss your chance, you miss your chance. We want there to be ways for people to engage in different ways and in multiple points along the process. We do want to emphasize evidence throughout the process, and so you're hearing that today. You'll hear that again and again throughout. And then we want to build on what we're learning as we go. And so the first part of that, to kind of keep from the role of NSF directly from being too great, is that we're setting up a committee for the future of NSF EPSCoR. This committee will have 12 to 16 national experts. We're expecting to draw broadly from our own community of investigators, jurisdictional offices, research leadership, both those who are currently deeply engaged, but also other institutions, other investigators who might not be deeply engaged with EPSCoR right now. But we don't want to limit it only to those who are in our jurisdictions also. There's obviously tons of expertise across the country on research ecosystems that can really give good input to this process, even though they're not based in a NSF jurisdiction. And so we really want to have others with expertise in broadening academic research capacity, advancing STEM inclusivity, improving STEM workforce development. And so we really want to have a diversity of perspectives, obviously also including kind of diversity in terms of demographics, diversity in terms of institutions. We really want there to be breadth in this group as well as depth. This committee is going to be the guiding force for the community engagement, and ultimately we'll be synthesizing the findings from this process into a final report. And just in terms of the mechanics to be compliant with federal regulations in terms of advisory bodies, formally this committee is going to be established as a subcommittee for NSF's existing Committee on Equal Opportunities in Science Engineering, CEOS. And I think many of you are going to be familiar with CEOS and their work. They really do make great partners for what we're trying to accomplish with this and how this process will go. So we're excited to have that connection as well. And so again, we're building this committee. We want people to be engaged with this committee. So I'm going to leave this up there for a minute because we are encouraging nominations, and that includes self-nomination. So if you want to be a part of this committee, absolutely send your contact information to us and a brief statement of nomination to the email address that's there. NSF EPSCoR@nsf.gov. It's a group email address that multiple people will see, but we're using it right now to collect nominations. If you want to nominate someone else who you think might not be at this meeting, but who would be great at this, just send us a few lines about who this person is, how to reach them, and why you think that they'd be great at this. The deadline for this is a fairly tight timeline because we want to keep to the overall timeline. And so we need to have all of these nominations by June 7 to be fully considered. And the reason why we can get away with having these initial points of contact be so brief is that we're going to follow up with everybody whose name we get. We're going to follow up and get a CV from them and get kind of a one-page statement of interest. And so if you're self-nominating, you can expect to see a request for that in follow-up. If you're nominating someone else, we'll reach out to them and say, hey, you've been nominated for this. If you're interested, please send these additional materials. And I'll make sure that this gets into the chat as well, although I think the email address is maybe easy enough to remember. And obviously, you can find this both on the existing website already, and this will be visible prominently in the Dear Colleague letter that's coming out as well. So moving on from the committee, what are we going to do? What are the actual activities going to be? So there's kind of two big activities up front and then a culminating workshop at the end. So the big activities up front is we're going to have a series of targeted virtual listening sessions. And so what each of these will be is our committee will meet with about 20 to 30 invited individuals, and each of these will represent a particular part of our stakeholder community. And so there might be one that's for track 1 administrators. There might be another one that's for track 2 and track 4 PIs. There might be another one for researchers and leadership from minority serving institutions or other types of underserved institutions. You know, we're going to have them be thematic so that we're making sure that we're hearing perspectives from lots of different parts of our overall community. So we're envisioning, but then once we're inside the events, they're going to be lightly structured, not heavily scripted at all. And again, focusing on giving evidence-driven input. We're envisioning there being approximately 6 of these events total, 2 hours each. And again, each of them focus on different stakeholder groups from across our community. In parallel for that, we're going to set up a venue for providing written comments. This is actually a really valuable part of our process when we went through the eligibility modernization process a couple years ago, where we used the same email address actually to give a venue for people to submit written comments where they could send their thoughts, they could send their ideas if they wanted to develop things in writing a bit more. There was a pathway to be able to do that. We're not necessarily going to use the email address specifically for that this time. I think we're going to try to have a web-based form for this. But again, it's going to be a venue to give written input, and then all of that input will then be kind of given to the committee to be used as part of their deliberation. And then finally, building on the topics that are highlighted in these earlier listening sessions and through the written comments, later on in the year, there'll be a virtual community workshop. And there'll be invited presentations for this. We'll be building on themes that will again be virtual, that will be open to the community kind of across different parts of our stakeholder groups, to kind of bring these ideas together and start to synthesize the thinking, and to give kind of a final venue to kind of inform the committee before they go and do their work of developing a report based on everything that they've learned. So the timeline here is in June, we're going to have the committee selected, where it's an aggressive timeline. We're really hoping to have this committee nailed down by the end of June. There'll be a little bit of time for them to self-organize and do some background work in terms of reading and so on. The listening sessions and written comments will be through most of August that we'll have that available. We're targeting this community workshop for the September-October timeframe, so it's all going to be kind of a pretty quick turnaround. And then the committee will have time and space to develop their report, with the submission of the findings report happening in early 2022. And then last slide here, again, the Dear Colleague letter is pending. You can see, obviously, I had a space to slap the number in there. I will make sure that that's available to everyone here as soon as possible. And we'll have lots of pathways to get it out to you. The link there is for the website again, and I see it's in chat a couple times. I'll also say that if you go to the NSF EPSCoR main webpage, that you'll see the same link to the webpage there. You'll see a link to the Dear Colleague letter as soon as it's out as well. And then also linked from the website and linked from other places. It's kind of an ugly URL, so I didn't paste it in, but there's a place to put your information in a contact form. And so what this will mean is that the folks who sign up for this contact form, whenever there's any kind of update, you will get a message directly that communicates that update and lets you know. And so if you want to make sure that you don't miss anything throughout any of this process, go ahead and go to the webpage now, fill out the contact form, and that'll be the easiest way to make sure that you see every significant update that happens after that. And I will leave it there, and I'll leave this slide up for a minute. This is the take-home messages again. High visibility activity. There was, during the National Science Board discussion yesterday, there was lots of input there. I wouldn't be surprised to see some participation from National Science Board members in some of these activities. And so definitely this is going to have a lot of influence about EPSCoR's future planning. Your input is crucial, right? Like, we are depending on the advice that you give us, or for the input that you give us to guide our thinking and guide how this process will look and what the outcomes of this process will be. And there's the website again, for folks who missed it kind of the last half dozen times that it flashed in front of you. And from there, I will be happy to take questions. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing now.
Folks, feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat, or you can come off of mute and speak directly with Tim. You can raise your hand if there are a bunch of people that want to come off of mute at the same time. I see Prakash, looks like he has his hand raised.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Tim. That was a great presentation, very useful information. So I just wanted to know whether the goal of having this committee and all that, is it to, I know it's called to look at the future of NSF EPSCoR, but does that also look into, the current programs and in terms of, how do you make those programs better, or are also they going to take into consideration the endless frontiers in case you get a lot of, money flowing into EPSCoR programs? Like, how do you develop new programs, or how do you, try to manage add additional programs and all that? Or is it a combination of both, looking at the past as well as, fine tuning for the future? Thank you.
Sure. So I would say the first part of that is an explicit yes. And the second part of that is not explicitly part of the process, but reasonable to presume that it will influence the process. And so just to dive into that answer a little bit, part of the background, we want to make sure that this committee is informed about what EPSCoR is about and what has happened in the past. Especially like some of the folks who are on this committee will be part of our existing community, but some will not. And so we want to make sure that they're informed about what EPSCoR has done. And so we will be making available lots of resources, both publicly. Some of this will be available on the outward facing website. Maybe there will be other materials that are internal only because they have non-public data from NSF that are associated with it. And so we're going to make those materials available to the committee. The ones that are public will make available to the public as well, so it can inform the process and provide some evidence. And then there is going to be time built in early in the process to give the committee space to kind of become familiar with these materials as needed. In parallel, we're bringing on additional staff, some summer scholars to look at some questions that we know that we've developed in terms of what our portfolio looks like, and be able to dive into some of those questions. As that evidence kind of gets fleshed out, we're going to make sure that that's available to the committee, and where possible, we're going to make that available to the public as well. So the evidence part of it is certainly on our side of it, what we're bringing, but we know that there's a lot more thinking, a lot more evidence that can go into this that we can manage kind of internally. And that's why we're putting the pressure on the community as well to, when you're bringing your ideas and your thoughts, back those up with evidence as well, because the evidence that you're bringing will be influential to this process also.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Prakash. I see Sheena had her hand up.
Hi, Sheena Murphy from West Virginia. I have a question in regards to whether your listening groups will also include non-track investments from the EPSCoR program, such as the EPSCoR co-funding programs that you have. I don't know what fraction of your entire portfolio is invested in co-funding of non-track activities.
Sure. So about 20% of our budget goes to co-funding specifically. It varies year by year, but it's roughly that. I think and so there is a lot of overlap. So sometimes people get co-funding who are also associated with one of our projects on the tracks. But I think we are definitely looking to reach into the research institutions, the investigators, beyond the EPSCoR tracks. And so some of those will be folks who have been co-funded, but there's also people who might have just gotten NSF awards on their own, or who haven't successfully gotten an NSF award yet. And so I think there will definitely be a listening session that to investigators or administrators who are less directly connected to our RII activities right now. I don't know that we would limit that specifically to co-funding, that it would kind of be maybe co-funding and others who have other types of NSF funding.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
I
see Loretta has her hand up.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Tim. That was beautiful. And I wanted to add to that, while we have your outputs and your outcome data that you send us, and we roll that up, and Tim spoke to some of those numbers earlier, I think a very important part is hearing the stories. And so what we will request of you all is, if you remember last year's PI meeting, we asked each jurisdiction to present on the impact of EPSCoR. So I want you to do something similar. Develop that presentation, maybe a video with it, and we'll host it on that open website so that the committee members, but anybody who's interested in EPSCoR could see. Because while the numbers are great, hearing those impactful stories, I think they're really important. And we're going to ask it for track 1, but we're also going to request it for track 2, track 4, and others. And so we'll get, as soon as we can get our website firmly designed, we'll start asking you for that information and tell you where we would want to submit it. So you'll have a chance to talk about the impact of EPSCoR on your jurisdiction or on your institution or your project or your career. And I think that those stories are extremely important. And, you know, as Tim said, there was a EPSCoR presentation to the board yesterday. They're really excited. We were only able to highlight, you know, a handful, but they're really excited about hearing the bigger picture, you know, the impact across all 28 jurisdictions. I just wanted to add that, Tim.
Thanks.
We also have Edwin that has a question.
Thank you. I am interested in the number. I actually have more of a suggestion than a question, but it is in relation to the number that the graph regarding success in securing grants. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that, sorry, I'm just trying to lower the hand. The first thing that comes to my mind is that nothing beats seeing how the sausage is made. And one of the things that I believe that can be improved is the inclusion of people, especially junior faculty, that are related to EPSCoR into panels. Now, I don't know how NSF selects its panel reviewers. I do know that NASA has a portal where you basically volunteer, and if they need you, you sign up and send a CV, and if they need you, they call you. My experience probably reflects that of a lot of people, and it boils down to this. I had one postdoctoral advisor that gave me comments on one proposal once, another one that said, oh, you shouldn't be submitting a proposal because I'm submitting one to the same panel and we're going to be competing, so please don't. And the rest of the time is me thinking that I know how to write a proposal, which may be as good as 1 out of every 10. I don't know what the numbers are. To increase the success, you need to know what NSF wants. And it's not just about having good ideas, but putting it in a language that really attracts that panel to select your proposal and put it in the pile of fundable rather than in the, well, good ideas, but this is not fundable here. So there's 2 ways that I see this being improved. One is that I know NSF cannot be engaged directly into doing workshops saying, okay, this is what we want. And I was having this conversation with one of the EPSCoR people yesterday, but they can actually help other institutions or maybe even private consultants that can do that and do some kind of partnership that will train potential investigators in how to write better proposals. And the other one is actually increasing the number of EPSCoR people that can serve in these panels, so that they can see how the process works internally, because you can describe it to your heart's content and it doesn't beat just being through it and seeing it. So maybe that is a way that that graph can start ticking up upright in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree completely. I think everything that you've just said has been advice that I have given in presentations, and I know all of my colleagues have given in presentations. Do what you can do to get involved in NSF review processes. Reach out to your program officers in EPSCoR, but reach out to your program officers in your managing program and make clear that you're available. Some parts of NSF do run kind of email listservs that they broadcast out to potential reviewers and panelists whenever they have competitions. Other parts of NSF have other approaches to picking panelists, but expressing interest in getting your name in front of the appropriate program officers is definitely a way to go. Within EPSCoR, I will just, it can be a little bit tricky matching up reviewers with proposals because our competitions generally are cross a lot of different disciplines, and so there's some factors that go into our reviewer selection that's different, but we, just like everyone else, like send us your name and your background, and we do our best to kind of match you up with things. I think JD maybe has something to add to this.
Yeah, just really quick. One thing that's really important, I think, is in my time, at least at NSF, it's not necessarily what NSF wants per se, but it's because, you know, at the end of the day, we have no real control over the reviewers and the panel and what they say, right? And those heavily influence our decisions, right? And there's a lot to be said about basic training in terms of teaching good grantsmanship. And being involved in panels is absolutely one way to develop that, to see the larger picture, you know, but also getting that internal mentoring from within your jurisdictions and developing those mentor-mentee relationships with senior faculty who are successful is also critical. And just reading more and more projects, more and more grants, those are the pieces that are key. But you know, I don't think that it really comes down to what NSF wants per se. You know, there's certainly places where we have emphases, but it's at the end of the day, it's really what the reviewers and what your peers, what you all think of the project and how you express that. And I just really wanted to point that out.
Sure. Thanks, JD. I see a question in the chat from Jeff Mossy. He says there was going to be a rollout of new EPSCoR reporting requirements, I believe, next year. How will those be impacted by these new visioning efforts, and also by the new evaluation activities that we heard about before lunch? And so the reporting activities, I think there's not an explicit connection with the reporting requirements. I think they're still in development, but the reporting requirements are more about kind of improving the alignment between the structure of the reports and what the solicitations look like, to make sure that they kind of map a little bit more cleanly and to kind of remove some of the ambiguity about kind of what goes where. So that's more of kind of just helping to ease what the reports look like and remove some of the uncertainty for the people who are preparing the reports, and also hopefully make it a more consistent document across different projects for NSF to read and for to use as well. So that's kind of a little bit separate, although there's always kind of ways that they can map onto each other a little bit. I think that the connections to the evaluation efforts are much more tight, where certainly the evidence grounding and the program level evaluation and the questions that you saw about activities and academic research competitiveness and what should we look at, like those conversations and those questions that came out of the evaluation report definitely map closely about what kind of feedback and how we're looking to get feedback from you as well, so that evaluation will also be informing the future direction of the program, but also the input that we get from this process will be informing that evaluation, how they look at things. And so it's not like a clear kind of flow diagram necessarily that you can have one going from the other, but the two efforts are definitely intertwined and informing each other as they go. I hope that answered your question, Jeff. And then Jean put a comment in there, just keeping in mind that keeping your own professional websites up to date is a good strategy, just in general, obviously, but I will, you know, speaking for myself, when I am trying to figure out if a reviewer is a good match for a proposal, their website is pretty much always the first place that I go in order to kind of understand what they're working on and what the keywords are and so on. And so I try not to get into the habit of setting somebody aside if their website doesn't match up. Like I try to look more deeply, but certainly it removes some of the activation energy to kind of draw on the same kind of catalyst analogy I used earlier today.
Tim, quick question. In terms of impact, how are you going to, I mean, I can see the individual stories and individual impacts you can easily gather, but I don't know how what strategies you all have to scale it at the jurisdictional scale, both spatially and temporally. So to give an example, I deal with the same problem. I can look at rainfall data, which changes spatially and also temporally, right? How do we average it? It's an unsolved problem pretty much. You guys have the same problem because you funded me and I impact many people actually. I help other people, I subfund them. There is no way for me to document those things. And you funded me in 2010 as a co-funding, and that transformed to many other, I got money from BP and many other places and published many papers. There's nowhere I had formally acknowledge to you guys. I don't know how I mean, it'll be awesome if you can find some way to spatially, temporally aggregate this information, which is, I think it's a lot more impactful than what you think, but you got to average it spatially and temporally.
Yeah, I appreciate the softball question there. So that is an incredible challenge, and I think if we knew the answer to that going in, then we wouldn't need a process like this, right? Like all the things would be there, all the things would be solved. We are hoping that this process yields pathways for us to either solve during this process or threads of investigation and threads of study and evaluation that we can use going forward. And so ideas that come from this community on how to do that better would be a great outcome from this whole process. Separate from that, or not separate, but kind of intertwined with that, this is a huge agenda item NSF-wide right now to understand these types of impacts better and the time duration of these impacts. And so there's data scientists across NSF that are looking at these problems at different ways. We're looking at how to do these things better, where we have, because of all the data collection that we've done over the years, we have a lot of information about what our projects looked like a decade or 15 years ago, and can now have the tools, the data tools available to us to kind of start to make those connections in a better way. And so we're working on that. There's people across NSF that are working on that. But working on that doesn't mean done, right? Like there's still lots of work to do. And so I think you'll over time see more of those connections start to be made, but we're not all the way there yet. And we want to be. Those are the types of things that we want to see in the evidence that comes out of this process. I saw Loretta's hand and then she pulled it back down. That's either good news or bad news.
No, of course not. I was just going to point out that's exactly why we're working with EAC. You heard from Cynthia and Clemencia earlier. So what are the other indicators that we can look at a 30,000 foot level to say if what we're doing is working without trying to follow up with each investigator every year for the remainder of their career? And Cynthia put in the chat box, there are a lot of AI implications for what we might be able to do to really be able to understand that. And so that's part of our learning agenda. Working with EAC is to understand what strategies we can use to really understand impact without having a burden put on the investigators and those that they support. For example, many of you support K-12 students. And it's great to be able to track them for your project and be able to point to their success. For us, we may want to look at overall STEM growth at the jurisdiction level. And we know that that takes time. It's not going to happen, the year after your project ends. And so we're trying to decide where do we come from collecting the outputs and the outcomes that you will have as a result of your projects, and also look at some of those national level indicators to say, are we moving in that direction? And they may not all be attributable to a particular project, but it could be attributable to some of the things that the state is doing and that the state is investing in. And so that's sort of where we're trying to bridge those worlds and use whatever strategies available, such as AI, to use evidence as a means of deciding what do we do next, what do we keep, what do we change, what do we add. And so we want to make sure we do it. We could easily add 3 more new tracks, but is that really moving jurisdictions in a direction that we want them to go? So we want to be more intentional in what we do with any funds that are available with our existing funds. And so that's sort of part of the Evidence Act. We think the visioning activity is a really important role. It allows the community to provide input. So we hope that you ran off to that website and click that link. Before the end of this session, we're going to be counting how many responses we got as a result of Tim's session. That's all I wanted to add.
Just for the record, there are 2 submissions for nominations since the start of this session.
Okay, Tim, you're not going to be able to take a break until we we got 100 participants, so I need at least 50 more submissions. And you can just sign up for more information. You don't have to volunteer to be on the committee. So let's get those coming in. Tim is being, let's see, encouraged to have outcomes.
I see Sheena's hand again. We're almost out of time, so maybe just this one last question.
Wondering if you were going to look at the entirety of NSF and how EPSCoR fits into that. Your background is, I would say, is multi-messenger astrophysics, one of the big ideas. And West Virginia is one of the few EPSCoR jurisdictions that actually can benefit from that big idea. So how have selections of projects or topical areas at NSF influenced the opportunities for the EPSCoR jurisdictions? And is there going to be an avenue for that type of discussion?
I think there is, so there's lots of avenues for lots of types of discussion. So yes, yes, absolutely. I think we do try to look at not just the EPSCoR projects and the EPSCoR mission itself, but how it connects and how we can connect and partner better. And so threads of discussion that lead to kind of specific ways that we could partner better, or ideas for how those partnerships could be developed, I think would again be great areas of discussion and to explore with this process.
All right.